My role today in this webinar is to really give you a tour of some of the developments in the last 6 to 8 months in the world of sanctions. And as most, if not all of you will know, if you're listening to this webinar, there's been an unprecedented amount of sanctions activity in response to the Russian war on Ukraine. There have then been a raft of changes to guidance, certainly designation activity, to licensing. We're going to step through some of those changes today. Now, towards the end of this webinar, I'll also be sharing some ideas on good sanctions compliance and what that is likely to mean at your firm. So let's move on to a slightly different topic, and that is the matter of enforcement. So at the pointier end of the sanctions regime. I think what is interesting here is that even before all this activity, which was focused on Russia, you had post-Brexit, the UK set up its own autonomous sanctions regime, and it also indicated that it was going to take sanctions enforcement more seriously. You had the maximum term of imprisonment for sanctions breach increase from 2 to 7 years. You also had powers to impose penalties by HM Treasury, which was then introduced. And those penalties can be very stiff indeed. Maximum is the greater of £1 million or 50% of the value of the funds or resources that have been dealt with in breach of sanctions. As I've already said, it's not just your business that could be exposed, but also corporate officers and senior management. Some other things which are relevant to sanctions compliance, consider whether, and a lot of this is quite similar to the AML world, but whether an individual with sufficient authority is responsible for sanctions adherence. So you don't want the person who is looking at your sanctions policy, who's responsible for making judgment calls on sanctions concerns and sanctions reporting, being somebody who doesn't hold sufficient weight within the company. It's a matter which is attracting more attention. It's going to attract more attention from enforcement authorities. You want to make sure that somebody with a greater degree of responsibility within the company is looking at it properly.